Have you ever heard somebody say, it'll all work out in the end? But I don't know your experience. In mine, that doesn't always seem to be the case, that everything just works out perfectly as I think it should. But really this idea of it will all work out in the end, it seems to stem from something the Apostle Paul wrote in his letter to the Roman Christians. In Romans chapter 8, verse 28, Paul wrote, "For those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose." So for those who love God, this idea that Paul is writing about there in Romans chapter 8, if you love God, you're going to follow God, you're going to do what God wants you to do, you're going to listen to God, you're going to believe in God and his plan for salvation. So to love God, you will believe in Jesus. So what Paul is saying there in Romans chapter 8 is that for those who love God, all things work together for good. And then there's a comma in the English, but what's interesting is that for those who love God, all things work together for good. He doesn't say all things work together for good according to my understanding of what good is. My limited understanding of eternity, of existence, of the world, all things work together according to what I want. That's not what he says at all. He says all things work together for good, absolute good, God's perception of good. All things will work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. And what is his purpose? His purpose, he actually says in the very next verse, in verse 29 of Romans chapter 8, he says it's to become more like Jesus. And so he wants us to become more like Jesus. Jesus is the ultimate example of love and compassion and absolute truth in eternity's perspective. And so we want to become more like Jesus, and that's God's purpose in us, is to help us to become more like Jesus. And so all things will then work together for good, for the ultimate good, his perspective, his understanding of good. And his understanding of ultimate good may not be what I understand ultimate good to look like, because in my estimation, again, I'm a selfish human being, a prideful human being. If everything were to work together to what I thought would be good, then everything would benefit me to the detriment of everybody else. But that's not how God sees it. God sees it from an eternal perspective, from a bigger perspective than just my want and what I perceive things need to be like. And so what Paul's saying in that verse, all things work together for good, God's ultimate good in bringing as many people as possible to heaven if they are willing to believe. And so that is God's understanding of good, God's introduction of that good through Jesus into the world if we would simply believe. And so do all things work out like I want them to work out? No. And honestly, thank goodness, because I've seen some things that I have wanted to work out and they've worked out the way I wanted, and it ended up being absolutely terrible and not at all what I thought. And so I'm eternally grateful that God has got a better perspective and a better understanding of what good is. And ultimately, if in this world, and this world is broken, this world is a broken system, it is not how God intended it to be. We see that in the Garden of Eden. God intended this world to be perfect, to be absolutely perfect, without sin, without sickness, without death, without pain. And then sin came into the world because of a choice that we human beings have made, and our sin broke God's perfect system. And breaking God's perfect system meant it introduced all those things that God did not intend to be here. The pain, the grief, difficulty, problems, one person being angry at another person and offended at another person, and backbiting and disease. None of that was intended to be in this world. But because sin broke God's perfect system, all of it exists here. And so God tries to help us get through this broken system by bringing us to love, by bringing us to Jesus. And finding Jesus, then we can experience the ultimate good through relationship with God and experience, in the end, heaven. So in the end, it will all work out for good. If not in this life, if not on this plane of existence, on this planet, it will be ultimately good in heaven at one point or another. And so will all things work together for good? Well, if you believe in Jesus, then yes, good is heaven. So yes, it will end up great. Good is not a big enough word. Probably our languages don't have a big enough word to describe how great that will be. But if we don't believe in Jesus, then what we experience in this life is as good as it's ever going to get, and we will never experience greatness. And so when we say, will all things ultimately work out? Well, if we're using that phrase without the understanding of Jesus, the origin of the phrase in the book of Romans, then no, everything will not work out. But if we include it as it was intended, as Paul wrote it in Romans chapter 8, then yes, absolutely, it will all work out out far beyond what we ever thought possible, far beyond what we ask or imagine. And the struggle that we experience now is not worth comparing to the joy that we will experience then.